Hi, this is Speak Out Speech and Debate, and today we're going to be discussing the first item on the Congress docket for NSDA Nationals 2023. So this is about a bill to abolish standardized testing requirements to foster student growth. And we'll go ahead and give you 3 points that you can possibly use on an affirmative speech, and then 3 points on a negative. So let's start off with the history of standardized testing just so that we can get a better grasp of this and understand what the opening speech will be about. Something that's probably going to be common with these sponsorship speeches is a reference to the history of where standardized testing comes from. So this piece of evidence that I cite here by McCardle is essentially saying that historically the first test used to track students into whether they were going to be in college preparatory classes or, for example, vocational classes to then on and go do manual labor as a future job. The thing that separated them were IQ tests and also Stanford Binet tests. By 1950, many American high schools implemented some form of this. And then oftentimes these exams, and most of the time, they would decide the student's academic outlook and allow them and their families little say in their appropriate or even desired academic programs. So essentially, these schools were boiling down all of their intelligence and all of their potential into just one test, and that would dictate whatever their life course would be. So clearly, this eventually came to have some discriminatory roots. It actually started with Irish immigrants back in early 1900s, and then eventually it would go on to discriminate against other minorities, for example, Black and Hispanic students who would grow up in these urban areas and not have as many resources to do well on these tests. And then the big point here is that the impact is how these tests really give these students little autonomy and therefore little social mobility throughout their lives. So it's just a perpetuating cycle, and you can link that to structural violence, how standardized testing is inherently structurally violent. And therefore, we wouldn't want to perpetuate such a system, which is why we are introducing this bill today. Another point that you could include as a warrant for why exactly you're advocating for this bill is about how standardized testing really is not an accurate reflection of a student's intelligence or even ability or potential. So this quote by Daniel Gruski talks about how it's really hard to sort kids into these homogeneous groups, and that when you do, you realize that, hey, not all of these students are actually at the same level. So really the purpose of standardized testing is to try to figure out what groups you can separate students in so that they either learn better or on a specific track to prepare them for their futures. So through this quote and the rest of that article that this is from, it talks about how even when you institute a standardized test, it really is limited in what exactly it can test. So sure, on paper, these students might seem to be all at the same level, but once you actually put them in a classroom and have them work on projects together, you'll realize that all of them have very different needs and have different capabilities as well. So that's just one example of why standardized testing is not really effective or even should be used. And then this next card goes on to talk about specifically how it's really not correlated with students' achievement and how this idea of standardized testing also is not standard. Oftentimes, it isn't even able to test very nuanced pieces that can separate students based on ability or intelligence. And because it's missing those parts, of course, it's not going to be a good indicator. And another thing that you can do is go farther and look for specific evidence on how standardized testing has impacted minority and low-income students, especially since this comes from a history of it discriminating against minorities. And on top of this, you can talk about how many of those groups of students don't have the proper resources to do well on standardized tests, whether it's because they go to a disadvantaged school with little funding and they won't be prepared for state testing, because their classes aren't teaching them the material, or because they don't have the connections or money to find tutors and programs to prepare them extensively for major tests like the SAT or ACT, which are directly linked to college admissions and whether or not you can achieve certain things like going to college and finding certain jobs afterwards. A nice twist to add in the chamber is to come up with an alternative. And this card right here is detailing the Renzulli model specifically. So this psychologist Renzulli came up with this idea of the SEM, which is a type of curriculum plan that they institute where they get students to be in heterogeneous groups, meaning that they have gotten rid of these ideas of standardized testing to try to separate students into classes, and instead just group all students into one class and cater the material so that they work in, for example, small groups where the perhaps higher achieving students are able to teach the lower achieving students, and in essence, the lower achieving students are learning about it, and the higher achieving students are actually learning it even better because it takes a lot to know the material well enough to teach someone else. So on top of this, this card talks about how the SEM has been instituted into many different schools across the US and how it has been very effective. So you can definitely cite those statistics and numbers. And then just on top of this, it's the fact that this already exists and is proving that we don't need standardized testing to have such achievement. And this also gets rid of those negative impacts where, for example, minority or low-income students are being discriminated against because of these standardized tests. And therefore, they can all be mixed into the same classes, the same groups, and achieve more diversity within the classroom, which is not only good for the students academically, but good for all of the students socially because you're increasing their awareness of diversity. So now let's move on to some possible negative ideas. So another point that you could include on a negative speech is the idea that standardized testing, although there is some evidence against it, it has been proven to be essential for students, particularly for the high achievers from disadvantaged areas. That's because standardized testing is a platform for them to differentiate themselves from their peers and show their aptitude in a way that is just on a piece of paper. It doesn't take into account where they're from, what they look like. It's really just about their learning abilities and how well they do. So I really encourage you to read through the rest of this article as it goes into much more detail about standardized testing and how that affects educational equity. But right now, this quote is talking specifically about how a lot of times students are separated into classes and then pathways that dictate their futures and their jobs, and it's all really just based on one person's opinion of them, either their parent or their teachers. And we can understand that there's a lot of human bias that can go into that when a single person is referring a student because they have their own ideas and own perceptions about that student that aren't necessarily related to their academic ability, but that can factor in when they're recommending them for a certain pathway. So if we just rely on standardized testing, then that means that we can take away all of that bias and just simply look at how much knowledge the student has and how well they're able to perform on specific topics that we're trying to test them on. So another item that you can bring up is the idea that once you take away standardized testing, then that makes it extremely hard for states to kind of keep students at the same levels across schools, and that creates some issues both for the teachers and students because once you do this, it creates this mixed heterogeneous class where you have high achieving students and low achieving students all in one class learning the same thing. And so this becomes very frustrating very quickly because those students, the high achieving students, are going to have to learn at a slower pace because they have to wait for the rest of the class to catch up, while the lower achieving students are going to be needing more remedial work. And a lot of times it's hard for them to even keep up. Then for the students in the middle, a lot of times they're kind of just ignored, and that can lead to a lot of apathy in trying to do work since oftentimes they're overlooked. So through this, it also creates issues for the teacher as well since they have to cater to all these different students, and as students as I said, are feeling apathetic towards the work, that can lead to behavioral issues. And so essentially, once you take away standardized testing, that opens the door for many of these other issues where more students' learning needs aren't met. So this piece of evidence here by Rosenbaum does a pretty good job of detailing that. I know it's pretty wordy, but it does kind of take you through that. And a good example they have is how when the teacher offered an extra assignment to the faster, more high-achieving students, those students actually didn't want to do it because they felt that it was unfair that they had to do more work. And of course, the students who were moving slower couldn't even get far enough to do that extra assignment. So that led to a lot of different standards on how the teacher was grading these students. And it creates a lot of issues, particularly since our education system, particularly with teachers, they're being overworked right now, and there's a lot of burnout across the United States. So you can kind of push on that point and talk about how, yes, standardized testing might not be a cure-all for trying to figure out where students are at, but if we take it away, then that's going to lead to way, way more issues. So an interesting idea you can add on a negative speech is the idea of being test optional and how that has affected colleges across the United States. So, of course, everyone knows the SAT, ACT, and how during the pandemic, many students were able to take those tests, so colleges across the U.S. went test optional. Students didn't have to submit those standardized test scores, and it would not be counted against them. However, now, after a few years of that, we're seeing the results of those students that were admitted under that process, and some colleges, for example, MIT, are now requiring standardized tests again. This is because after seeing the results of those admitted classes that were test optional, they realized that many of those students weren't performing in the college at a level that they expected. So now they want to institute standardized tests again to make sure that every student is at a certain benchmark, and that once they get into that college, they are all performing at a similar level and no one's falling too far behind, and that everyone is getting somewhat similar grades to make sure that they are catering to all students and able to meet those needs and not putting a student that is not ready for such workloads into that college. And another idea that you can include is how a lot of countries across the world also use standardized testing and have used it. For instance, South Korea, they perform very well in many different academic areas and have instituted a major standardized test to gain college admissions. Many East Asian countries do this. China, for example, also does one with the Gaokao. But I think South Korea is a unique example just because of how well they perform in academics and how, additionally, how big the admissions process is and how much they rely on that standardized test and how they utilize it. So that could be an interesting point to include in your example as well, and of course, relate it back to the United States. I hope this video helped you to prepare for Congress at NSDA Nationals, and good luck to all the Congress debaters out there. Again, please don't forget to follow Speak Out Speech and Debate on Instagram. It's at speakout_speech, and have a fun time in Phoenix.